Blood was pooling on the warehouse floor, and the cold barrel of a Glock was pressed firmly against the back of my neck. "Save him," a voice growled from the shadows, "or you don't walk out." I looked down at the city's most feared cartel boss and froze. I knew him. The rain in Chicago always felt different at 3 in the morning. It didn't just fall. It cut through the wind like ice. Dr. Leora Hayes pulled her trench coat tighter around her shoulders, the exhaustion of a 14-hour trauma shift settling deep into her bones. She had just left the glowing, sterile sanctuary of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, her mind a blur of cardiac monitors, sutured lacerations, and the bitter taste of stale break-room coffee. Her worn leather tote felt like it weighed 50 pounds as she walked toward the desolate staff parking structure. The concrete echoing with each step usually gave her a sense of solitary peace, but tonight the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. Leora reached into her pocket for her keys, her fingers brushing against the cold metal, when a sudden, sharp scraping sound echoed to her left. Before she could turn her head, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. The smell of leather, damp wool, and metallic gunpowder flooded her senses. "Don't scream. Don't fight. You do exactly as we say, Doc, and you live to see tomorrow." The voice was gravelly, devoid of any empathy. Leora struggled, her medical instincts warring with pure adrenaline. But the man was built like a cinder block. A rough canvas bag was yanked over her head, plunging her into suffocating darkness. Her wrists were grabbed and bound with thick plastic zip ties, biting into her skin. She was shoved forward, her knees scraping against the bumper of a large vehicle before she was thrown into the back seat of what felt like a heavy SUV. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural V8 sound, and the tires squealed against the wet pavement. "Keep your head down," another voice barked from the front seat. Leora's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to steady her breathing, relying on the same clinical detachment she used when a coding patient was wheeled into her OR. Assess the situation. Preserve oxygen. Do not panic. But it was hard to remain clinical when the scent of fresh blood began to overpower the smell of the damp canvas over her head. Someone in this vehicle was bleeding heavily. The drive felt endless, a chaotic blur of sharp turns, sudden accelerations, and the splash of deep puddles. When the vehicle finally lurched to a halt, the heavy iron screech of a garage door echoed around them. Leora was dragged out, her legs numb, and half carried down a flight of concrete stairs. The air grew stale, smelling of rust, mildew, and bleach. The bag was ripped from her head. Leora blinked against the harsh, unforgiving glare of industrial fluorescent lights. She was in a massive, subterranean basement. Concrete walls, no windows. In the center of the room, positioned over a plastic tarp, was a heavy steel work table. Above it hung a cluster of surgical lights that looked like they had been stolen directly from a clinic. Standing around the table were 3 men in dark clothing, their faces hardened, tattoos peeking out from their collars. But her eyes were immediately drawn to the man standing closest to her. He was tall, with a broken nose and cold, calculating eyes. He held a Sig Sauer pistol, tapping it impatiently against his thigh. "Cut her ties," the man ordered. One of the thugs sliced the plastic binding on Leora's wrists. She rubbed her raw skin, her eyes darting around the room. "Who are you? What do you want?" The tall man stepped aside, gesturing to the steel table. "We need a doctor. And you, Dr. Hayes, are the best trauma surgeon in the city." Leora finally looked at the table. A man was lying there, unconscious, his white button-down shirt soaked through with a terrifying amount of arterial blood. His breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound that indicated a compromised lung. Gunshot wounds, the tall man, who Leora would later learn was named Jack, said flatly. 2 to the chest, 1 to the lower abdomen. You're going to get the bullets out, stop the bleeding, and stabilize him. All the tools you need are on that tray. Leora approached the table, her hands trembling slightly before her professional training overrode her fear. She looked at the tray. Sterile scalpels, forceps, clamps, a portable suction machine, and IV bags of O-negative blood. It was a fully stocked, black market operating theatre. She looked at the patient's face. He was pale, his dark hair matted with sweat. He had a strong, aristocratic jawline and sharp cheekbones, but his features were currently slack with impending shock. Leora knew who he was. Everyone in Chicago who read the news knew who he was. Daniel Rossi. He was the ruthless head of the Rossi Syndicate, a criminal empire that controlled the ports, the underground casinos, and half the illicit trade in the Midwest. He was a ghost to the police, a phantom to his enemies, and right now he was bleeding out on a cold steel table in front of her. "If he dies," Jack said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, stepping up right behind her. He pressed the barrel of the Glock firmly against the back of her neck. "You don't walk out of here. Save him." "I need space," Leora snapped, the doctor in her taking over, pushing the terror down into a small box in her mind. "Back off and get me a pair of surgical gloves. Now!" Jack hesitated, then stepped back, holstering his weapon. For the next 2 hours, the basement transformed into a war zone. Leora worked with frantic precision. Daniel's blood pressure was dangerously low. She barked orders at the cartel men, forcing them to act as scrub nurses. She found the first bullet lodged dangerously close to his subclavian artery, extracting it with a terrifyingly steady hand. The second bullet had fractured a rib, but missed the lung by millimeters. The abdominal wound was messy, requiring extensive suturing to repair a torn bowel. She clamped, cut, and sewed, her scrub top plastered to her back with sweat. The room was dead silent, save for the mechanical whir of the suction machine and the rapid, strained sound of Daniel's breathing. "Forceps," she demanded. Jack handed them over. With a final, sickening metallic clink, she dropped the third and final bullet into a stainless steel basin. She tied off the last suture, packed the wounds with hemostatic gauze, and stepped back, her chest heaving. "He's stabilized," Leora breathed out, wiping her forehead with the back of her bloody wrist. "The bleeding has stopped, but he needs a sterile environment to prevent infection. I've done all I can do here." Jack stared at the steady rise and fall of Daniel's chest. "You're not going anywhere, Doc. You stay until he wakes up." The aftermath of an adrenaline rush is a violent crash. Leora sat on a rusted folding chair in the corner of the basement, her hand shaking so hard she could barely hold the lukewarm bottle of water one of the guards had tossed her. It had been 4 hours since the surgery. Daniel Rossi was still unconscious, hooked up to an IV drip and a portable vital signs monitor that beeped with a slow, steady rhythm. The heavy steel door to the basement was locked from the outside. Jack had left her with one guard, a young, nervous-looking kid named Toby, who gripped his rifle like it was a life preserver. Leora stood up, her joints aching. "I need to check his wounds," she told Toby, her voice raspy. "I need to ensure the packing is holding and there's no secondary hemorrhaging." Toby nodded quickly, stepping back to give her space. Leora approached the makeshift operating table. Daniel looked less like a fearsome mafia boss and more like a broken, vulnerable man. His breathing was deeper now, more regular. She grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of sterile saline, intending to clean the dried blood from his torso to monitor for any bruising that might indicate internal bleeding. As she gently wiped away the dark, copper-smelling stains from his lower left ribcage, she noticed something. During the frantic surgery, she hadn't paid attention to the canvas of his skin, only the trauma. But now, under the harsh glare of the surgical lights, she saw it. Daniel shifted slightly in his sleep, a low groan escaping his lips. He reflexively tried to turn his body, his arm coming down as if to shield his left side, even in unconsciousness. Leora gently moved his arm back to check the surgical site. As she did, her breath caught in her throat. There, etched deeply into the skin of his lower left ribcage, just below the fresh bandages, was a scar. It wasn't a bullet wound or a knife slice. It was a jagged, star-shaped burn, heavily textured, overlapping a distinct, horizontal laceration that looked like it had been caused by rusted barbed wire. Leora's heart stopped. The bottle of saline slipped from her hands, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. No, it can't be. The basement wall seemed to close in around her. The sterile smell of the room vanished, replaced in her memory by the choking scent of smoke, burning wood, and cheap linoleum. 1999. The Stanton Foster Home. She was 8 years old. A fire had broken out in the kitchen, raging through the old, rotting Victorian house. Leora had been trapped in the downstairs pantry, choking on thick black smoke. The door had jammed. She remembered the heat, the terrifying realization that she was going to die. And then the door was violently kicked open. A teenage boy, maybe 14, had burst through the flames. He was another foster kid, a quiet, brooding boy with dark hair who always sat in the corner and never spoke to the adults. The other kids called him Tommy. Tommy had grabbed her, throwing his jacket over her head. As they ran toward the back exit, a burning beam collapsed, blocking the door. Tommy hadn't hesitated. He pushed Leora through a shattered ground-floor window, right into a tangle of rusted barbed wire that separated the property from an alley. Leora had made it out with mere scratches, but she watched in horror from the grass as Tommy, trying to follow her, was caught by a secondary explosion. The flames licked his side, and he tore himself through the barbed wire, shredding his skin to escape the inferno. He collapsed on the lawn, his left side a mess of horrific burns and deep cuts. When the paramedics arrived, they took them to different hospitals. Leora never saw Tommy again. The social workers said he ran away from the burn ward 3 weeks later. He vanished into the system, becoming a ghost. Leora stared at the face of Daniel Rossi, the ruthless mafia boss, the killer, the extortionist. She looked back at the jagged, star-shaped burn and the parallel barbed wire scars. They were identical, unique, impossible to replicate. "Tommy," Leora whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. Daniel's eyes snapped open. They weren't groggy or disoriented. They were sharp, dark, and filled with a sudden, violent panic. He winced, a hiss of pain escaping his teeth as he tried to sit up, but his muscles failed him. His gaze locked onto Leora, then darted down to where she was staring, at his exposed left side. With a strained, aggressive motion, Daniel pulled his bloody, ruined shirt over the scar, hiding it from view. His chest heaved, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. "What did you say?" Daniel rasped, his voice a dry, dangerous gravel. Leora stepped back, her hands trembling. You tried to hide it. When I was cutting your clothes off earlier, you fought me on the left side. Even unconscious, you were protecting it." "Doctor," Daniel said coldly, ignoring her words. "You're stepping into territory that will get you killed. Step back." "You're Tommy," Leora said, her voice rising, the shock overriding her fear of the gun-toting guard in the corner. "Stanton Foster Home, 1999. You saved me from the pantry." Daniel's jaw clenched so tight Leora thought it might snap. He stared at her, studying her face. The severe, tightly pulled bun, the dark circles under her eyes, the shape of her jaw. For a fraction of a second, the cold mask of the Mafia boss cracked, and she saw the ghost of the 14-year-old boy who had pulled her from the fire. "Leora," he whispered. The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. He knew. He had known who she was. "You knew," she accused, stepping closer again. "When you got shot, you didn't just grab a random doctor. You told them to get me." Daniel gritted his teeth, suppressing a cough that rattled his chest. "I didn't tell them to get you to save me, Leora. I told them to get you to save yourself." Leora frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The shooting," Daniel panted, his hand gripping the edge of the steel table. "It wasn't a rival crew. It was Jack, my own men. They ambushed me." Leora's blood ran cold. She glanced toward the heavy steel door where Jack had exited. "But Jack brought you here. He brought me here to operate." "Jack brought me here to die on the table," Daniel said, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of his pale lips. He needed a doctor to make it look like they tried everything. Plausible deniability for the rest of the outfit. And when I flatlined, he was going to put a bullet in your head and dump your body in the river. No witnesses. Daniel forced himself up onto his elbows, the fresh sutures groaning under the strain. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers wrapping tightly around Leora's wrist. "You weren't kidnapped to save my life, Leora," Daniel whispered, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You were kidnapped so I could keep you out of the crossfire. The hospital is compromised. They were coming for you tonight because of who you are to me. And now we have to get out of this basement before Jack realizes I'm still breathing." The basement air suddenly felt impossibly thin. Leora stared at Daniel, her mind struggling to process the monumental shift in reality. The boy who had saved her from the fire was now the most dangerous man in Chicago, and he had orchestrated her kidnapping to protect her from a hit he knew was coming. "They were going to kill me?" Leora whispered, the chilling realization settling into her bones. "Why?" "Because in this life, leverage is currency," Daniel rasped, fighting a wave of nausea as he gripped the edge of the steel table. "Jack allied with the Calabrese family. They want my territory, the ports, the transit lines. They knew they couldn't just assassinate me without my loyalists tearing the city apart. So, they needed me to disappear quietly, and they needed to neutralize my only weakness." "Weakness?" Leora echoed. Daniel's dark eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "You think I just forgot about you, Leora? You think I didn't keep watch? They dug into my past. They found the paper trail, the anonymous trusts that paid for your tuition at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine, the shell company that bought the building your private practice operates out of. Jack found out that the ruthless Daniel Rossi had a guardian angel he was secretly funding. They were going to use you to break me." Leora's breath hitched. He paid for medical school? The anonymous benefactor she had written thank you letters to for a decade. It was Tommy. It was the Mafia boss bleeding on her table. Before she could process the weight of that revelation, the heavy scraping of boots echoed from the top of the concrete stairs. Daniel's demeanor instantly shifted from a wounded man to an apex predator. He looked at Toby, the young, trembling guard in the corner. "Toby!" Daniel barked, his voice laced with absolute, terrifying authority. The kid jumped, his rifle shaking. "You know who I am. You know what I do to traitors. Mr. Rossi, I swear I didn't know Jack was going to—" Toby stammered, his face pale. "I know you didn't, kid. You're Michael Russo's boy. Your father was loyal to me until the day he died. This isn't the days of Tony Accardo or Sam Giancana. Loyalty is rare, but I know your blood, Daniel said, speaking rapidly as the footsteps grew louder. Jack is coming down those stairs to put a bullet in my head, and then he's going to shoot the doctor. And who do you think he's going to pin the mess on, Toby? He needs a fall guy. You're the only loose end. Toby's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked at the heavy steel door, then back at Daniel. Cut me loose from these IV lines. Give me your sidearm and you live. You walk away with $100 grand from my personal vault, and I make sure the Calabrese family never finds you, Daniel demanded, holding out a bloody, trembling hand. Decide. Now. The lock on the heavy iron door clacked loudly. Toby made his choice. He sprinted forward, drawing a sleek Beretta 9mm from his waistband, and shoved it into Daniel's hand. Leora didn't hesitate. Her surgical instincts took over. She grabbed a heavy steel D-cylinder of oxygen from the portable cart and dragged it toward the doorway, her adrenaline masking the sheer weight of the tank. "Doc, get down!" Daniel hissed. The heavy door swung open. Jack stepped in, a suppressed Glock raised, a cruel smirk plastered on his face. "All right, Doc. Time's—" He stopped dead, seeing the empty table. Hiss! Leora had cracked the valve on the oxygen tank and shoved it forcefully across the slick concrete floor. It spun wildly, creating a massive, chaotic distraction of pressurized air that blew sterile drapes and medical packaging across the room. Jack swore, tracking the movement, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Daniel had braced himself against the concrete pillar beside the operating table. Despite the fresh sutures in his abdomen tearing, despite the agonizing pain radiating through his chest, his aim was flawless. Bang! Bang! The Beretta roared in the confined space. The first hollow-point round caught Jack in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second took him in the kneecap. The usurper collapsed with a heavy, agonizing scream, his Glock clattering uselessly across the floor. Silence descended on the basement, broken only by the sharp hiss of the oxygen tank and Jack's wet groans of pain. Daniel slumped against the pillar, his face ashen, the Beretta dropping from his weakened grip. Blood began to seep through the fresh white bandages wrapped around his torso. "We have to go," Leora said, her voice shaking but her actions decisive. She rushed to Daniel, throwing his heavy, uninjured arm over her shoulder. She looked at Toby, who was frozen in shock. "Toby, get the keys to the SUV. Help me get him up the stairs." Toby snapped out of his trance, grabbing Jack's dropped keys and rushing to support Daniel's other side. Together, they hauled the wounded cartel boss up the steep concrete steps. Every movement drew a ragged gasp from Daniel, but he refused to slow down. They burst into the cold, rainy garage. Toby unlocked the heavy armored SUV. Leora helped push Daniel into the passenger seat, buckling him in before sprinting to the driver's side. "Go to the safe house in Pilsen," Daniel rasped to Toby. "Wait for my call." Toby nodded frantically and disappeared into the rainy night. Leora slammed the SUV into drive, the heavy tires tearing out of the garage and onto the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. She merged onto Lower Wacker Drive, the cavernous subterranean roadway providing a perfect cover from prying eyes and cartel scouts. The neon lights of the city bled in streaks across the windshield. "Where are we going?" Leora demanded, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. "You're bleeding through your packing. You need a sterile ICU, Daniel. If you lose any more blood, you'll go into hypovolemic shock." "No hospitals," Daniel breathed, his head resting against the cold glass of the window. "Calabrese men will be watching every ER from Cook County to Rush Memorial. Go to the Gold Coast, 1400 North Astor Street. Penthouse. There's a private elevator. The code is 1999. Leora's heart skipped a beat at the code. The year of the fire. The Astor Street penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and Italian leather overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. Leora practically carried Daniel out of the private elevator and laid him out on the massive kitchen island, sweeping aside expensive crystal decanters and architectural blueprints. "Stay with me, Tommy," Leora ordered, the old name slipping out naturally as she tore open the high-end first-aid trauma kit Daniel had pointed out in the pantry. Daniel managed a weak, exhausted smirk. "Haven't heard that name in a long time, Doc." "Well, you're acting like a reckless teenager, so it fits," she shot back, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She cut away his ruined bandages. The sutures had held, but the capillaries around the wound had burst under the strain of the gunfight. She cleaned the area, applied heavy pressure with sterile gauze, and tightly rewrapped his torso. Once she was certain he wasn't actively hemorrhaging, the adrenaline finally left her system. Leora collapsed onto a velvet bar stool, her scrub top stained with blood, her hands trembling. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a long, shuddering breath. A heavy, warm hand gently touched her shoulder. She looked up. Daniel had managed to sit up on the edge of the marble island. He looked battered, pale, and incredibly lethal, yet the way he looked at her was entirely stripped of the Daniel Rossi persona. It was just him. "You saved my life. Again," he said softly. "You kidnapped me," she retorted, though there was no real venom in her voice. "I extracted you," he corrected gently. "If I had sent my men to just pick you up, you would have fought them. You would have called the police, and the police in my payroll would have handed you straight to Jack. Bringing you to me was the only way to ensure you stayed breathing." Leora stared at him, tracing the harsh lines of his face. "Why? Why do all of this for me? You vanished. I thought you were dead for 25 years. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his dark, messy hair. "When I ran away from the burn ward, I had nothing. I fell in with the street crews. I did things, Leora. Terrible things to survive. I became a monster because the world demanded a monster. But every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the little girl in the pantry. You were the only pure thing I ever touched." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a streak of dried blood from her cheek. Leora leaned into his touch instinctively, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. "I made money. I gained power," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And I used it to watch over you. I made sure you went to the best schools. I made sure your clinic was funded. I couldn't be a part of your world, Leora. The blood on my hands would have ruined you. So I worshipped you from the shadows." Tears pricked Leora's eyes. She thought about her life, the strange strokes of luck, the anonymous scholarships, the safe neighborhoods she always managed to find apartments in. He had orchestrated her entire safety net while living in a world of violence. "And what happens now?" Leora whispered, looking down at his chest, at the jagged edge of the burn scar peeking out from the fresh bandages. "Jack is dead, but the Calabresi family is still out there. They still know about me." Daniel's jaw set, the ruthless mafia boss returning to his eyes. "Tonight, I make a phone call to Carmine, my underboss in New York. By tomorrow morning, the Calabresi family will be dismantled. The Chicago outfit will be purged. Anyone who knew your name will be erased." He gently cupped her face, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "But you have a choice, Doc. In the morning, I can put you on a private jet. I can set you up with a new identity, a new clinic in Europe or on the coast. You will be completely safe, and you will never have to see my face again." Leora looked into the eyes of the boy who had dragged her through the fire and the man who had bled to keep her safe. She had spent her entire life trying to save people on an operating table, trying to bring order to the chaos of the human body. But looking at Daniel, she realized some chaos wasn't meant to be fixed. It was meant to be embraced. She reached up, her hand covering his. She slid off the bar stool, stepping into the space between his knees as he sat on the island edge. Carefully, mindful of his wounds, she wrapped her arms around his neck. "I already survived one fire with you, Tommy," she murmured, her lips inches from his. "I'm not running away from this one." Daniel let out a ragged breath, pulling her close. When his lips crashed against hers, it wasn't the tentative kiss of an old friend. It was fierce, desperate, and possessive, a vow sealed in blood, smoke, and survival. The monster of Chicago had finally found his heart, and the doctor had finally found the only man she couldn't cure, but could completely love. Did this intense, high-stakes mafia romance leave you on the edge of your seat? If you loved the twists, the gritty medical drama, and the explosive chemistry between Leora and Daniel, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow romance readers and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding original stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed with Daniel?